Good morning and welcome. Thank you for joining us today. BSEN ISO 19011-2026 is the newly revised guidance standard for auditing management systems, replacing the 2018 edition. This webinar is designed to explain what's changed and what the context for those changes is. Crucially, the standard focuses on the new context of remote auditing and how competence is evaluated for everyone in the audit process, including audit program managers, individual auditors, and audit teams. Attendees will gain clear practical guidance on demonstrating and assessing the knowledge, skills, and personal attributes needed to plan, conduct, and report audits with confidence. Next slide, please. This is some housekeeping. As a reminder, the webinar is a listen-only online event. Microphones and cameras will remain off for attendees. Please submit questions using the question button at the top right of the screen. Questions will be addressed following the presentations. Please report any technical issues to the same question box. Upon completing the feedback survey, BSI will provide a link to the event recording. To learn more about BSI's upcoming events, please scan the QR code. Next slide, please. This is today's agenda. And welcome to Housekeeping, the Changing World of Work, Rethinking Audit Practice with Alex, and understanding the changes to BSEN ISO 19011 with Linda. We'll have a 20-minute question and answer session, answering live questions and pre-submitted questions, and then we'll have some closing statements, and we will finish at 11 o'clock. Next slide, please. So to introduce our excellent speakers today, we have Linda Cooper, who has been involved with standards for 30 years and is passionate about their importance to businesses and societies. She's been chair of the BSI Committee for IT Service Management, represented the UK and ISO level, and is editor of ISO IEC 20001. Linda sits in various other committees, including for the update of ISO 19011. As a consultant, assessor, auditor, and trainer, Linda has used ISO 19011 and trained others in its use. Linda was also very recently awarded the BSI 2026 Leadership Award for her work on the ISO 20000 Service Management Series. Linda's journey into standards was when she worked for a large IT outsourcing company. She was approached by their marketing manager that BSI was setting up a committee about IT service management. You are our expert, Linda. Will you go along and see if this is worthwhile to get involved? That was in the mid-1990s. This eventually resulted in the ISO IEC 20001 standard, which is the 8th most certified management standard globally, management system standard globally. Alexander Woods, PCQI, is a research manager at the Chartered Quality Institute, CQI. His work focuses on research and development to advance quality practice and support the development of professional competence, with a particular interest in the future of work, the impact of technology, and the digital transformation of quality. He is actively involved in international standards development, contributing to ISO committees and working groups responsible for key management system and auditing standards, including ISO 9001 and ISO 19011. Alex's journey into standards is that after a stint working in mobile technology startups, he pursued his interest in learning and development through design of occupational standards and vocational training programs. In information technology, since joining the CQI 13 years ago, he has worked extensively on professional competence frameworks, career pathways, and research into the evolving role of quality professionals. His interest in how good practice is defined, shared, and improved led naturally to involvement in standards development, where he now represents the CQI in a number of international standards committees concerned with quality management and auditing. Next slide, please. So this is what's coming up today for you. We will have Alex speaking on the context of 19011, so changing context, assurance lagging behind reality. And then Linda will speak on the changes themselves in 19011, so terms and definitions, principles, managing an audit program, conducting audit, competence of auditors, and then the Annex A guidance updates. Next slide, please. Please go ahead, Alex. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Gavin, for that introduction, and thank you, BSI, for inviting me to take part in today's webinar. I'm not sure if being at the top of the billing is an advantage or not, but I think it's important before we get into the meat of what has changed in 19,011 to step back and look at the wider context. Because the important point here is not just that the standard has been revised, it's the conditions in which auditing operates, which have shifted quite significantly since the previous edition. And if we don't start here, it's very easy to treat the revision as a narrow technical update, when in fact it reflects something much broader that is happening across audit and assurance. Next slide, please. So to start off, why the context matters more, or at least as much, as the clauses. This section really is about why that context matters. 19,011-2026 is widely described as being an evolutionary update, and that's true up to a point. But that description can also obscure a more important point, which is that the conditions in which auditing operates have changed quite markedly since the last edition. The CQI's research has consistently shown that many assurance models were developed for environments that were more stable, more observable, and more clearly bounded than those organisations face today. So the purpose of this context settings section is not to preview the detailed changes in the revised guidance. Linda will come on to that later. It's to explain why long-established audit processes and approaches are now under increasing strain and scrutiny. Over the last decade, organisations have faced faster cycles of change, greater interconnection between systems, and much more external scrutiny. And taken together, those factors can create a growing mismatch between traditional periodic audit practices and the realities of modern organisational risk. The CQI's research on the future of assurance frames this as a structural issue rather than a failure of professional judgment on the part of organisations, quality professionals, or management systems auditors. In other words, auditors may still be applying sound principles, but they're doing so in environments that no longer behave in the way those principles originally assumed. So by bringing the context into the foreground, we can see the revision of ISO 19011 not as an isolated technical exercise, but part of a broader professional response to changing conditions. The fundamentals of audit still matter, but their application has to evolve if assurance is to retain credibility and value in a more complex, faster moving and scrutinised world. Next slide, please. The CQI research also points to an underlying shift that goes beyond any single standard or guidance document. The environment in which organisations operate has changed faster than assurance practice has adapted. Many audit models still reflect assumptions of relatively stable, fairly linear cause and effect, and clearly defined system boundaries. But our work on the future of assurance and the future of work suggests that these assumptions are becoming increasingly fragile. Organisations operate in conditions marked by constant change, overlapping risks, rapid decision-making, often supported by digital systems. And in that kind of environment, assurance activities that are based mainly on periodic sampling or retrospective records can struggle to provide confidence about current conditions and emerging risks. This doesn't mean, as before, that auditors are failing to apply professional judgment. Again, the point is more structural than personal or competence-based. The problem is that many of the frameworks and tools in use were not designed for this level of volatility. And our research highlights that growing gap between how organisations actually function and how assurance and governance and improvement activities are actually configured. That gap shows up in frustrations on both sides, Auditors are often expected to deliver insight with tools that are designed mainly for compliance and conformance checking, while organisations may question the relevance and value of assurance output that seems too backward looking. So if we can recognise that underlying shift, I believe we can better understand ISO 19011 2026 as part of a necessary recalibration. Direction of travel is towards assurance that is more adaptive, more risk-focused, and more aligned with strategic decision-making, not simply more detailed or more prescriptive. Next slide, please. The next part of this context is about three interconnected themes: complexity, risk, and technology. And these are central to understanding why audit practice is having to adapt. The point here is that organisations are now operating in more volatile and interconnected conditions. Risks are increasingly systematic, and the systems auditors are looking at are often less neat and less bounded than traditional models assume. So we're going to spend a little bit of time looking at each of these shifts in turn. Next slide, please. The idea of a VUCA world, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, features strongly in the CQI's research and development work. And it's not a term that should be unfamiliar. What our work emphasizes is that risk is increasingly systematic rather than localized. In other words, risk often arises not from one isolated failure, but from the interactions between processes, technologies, and external dependencies. And in that kind of environment, the risk is that traditional audit assumptions and approaches become harder to sustain. Sampling based on historical performance may still tell us something useful, but it offers only limited insight into future resilience. Likewise, tightly defined audit scopes can miss the way that risk moves across systems and functions. So our view is that assurance in a VUCA context needs to be more dynamic and more contextual. It also has to recognise that certainty is lower, that change is continuous, and that professional judgment becomes even more important. For auditors, this can create a real tension between the understandable desire for definitive conclusions and the reality that in more complex conditions, we are often dealing in provisional and risk-informed judgments. This helps explain why risk-based thinking has become more and more prominent over time, not as a matter of theory, but as a practical response to how modern organisations fail, adapt, and recover. And I can modestly claim some credit on behalf of the CQI for making sure that that risk-based thinking approach became embedded in the previous edition of ISO 19011 and remains there now. It also underlines that assurance value increasingly lies in identifying emerging vulnerabilities and interdependencies rather than simply confirming conformity at a single point in time. Next slide, please. The CQI's work around the digital transformation of quality and Quality 4.0 offers a helpful lens here. Modern organisations often behave less like neatly defined systems and more like complex adaptive networks. Integrated management systems, cross-functional processes, and blurred organisation boundaries are increasingly common. And digitalisation has accelerated that trend, in many cases made the distinction between individual systems increasingly artificial. And for audit and assurance, that can create a fundamental challenge. The documented management system can end up lagging behind the lived reality of how work is actually done. And where assurance activities focus mainly on formal structures rather than operational behaviour, they can then become disconnected from the organisation as it really functions. Our research suggests that this is one reason audit is sometimes seen as a lower value or overly bureaucratic exercise. So by recognising organisational complexity as a contextual driver, we reinforce the point that assurance approaches need to reflect how organisations truly operate. Now, obviously, this is very context dependent on geography, on size of organisation, on sector, complexity, maturity of the systems. And this doesn't mean abandoning structure or discipline, but it does require greater attention to those interfaces, those interactions, and emergent behaviour. So seen in that light, the evolution of audit guidance is a response to the growing gap between design systems and real world practice. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the next part of this context brings in two further dimensions. First, changes in the nature of evidence, and second, changing expectations about the value of audit. Next slide, please. So technology is reshaping both what organisations rely on and how assurance is performed. As our work on digital transformation makes clear, organisational outcomes are increasingly influenced by automated systems, algorithms, data-driven decision-making. And this is a trend which we can only expect to accelerate, become more common and more complex as time and technology evolves. This means the information that auditors are working with is often digital, it's often indirect, and often generated without direct human involvement. And this challenges more traditional ideas of objective evidence, which are often grounded in direct observation and manual records. So there's a particular risk highlighted here, where auditors may be asked to place confidence in outputs without necessarily having full visibility of the underlying processes, especially where proprietary or complex technologies are involved. At the same time, remote and hybrid ways of working have normalised the use of technology in the delivery of audit itself. So the auditor's engagement with the organisation can be more mediated than previously. And the key issue here is not whether technology is inherently positive or negative, it's how assurance adapts if it's to remain credible when evidence becomes increasingly abstract. So technology is changing that balance between trust, verification, and professional judgment. And it's one of the reasons that audit guidance needs to evolve alongside digital transformation. Next slide, please. Our work on workforce insights and the state and priority of quality and management systems audit professions adds an important human dimension to this picture, which really can't be overstated. Workforces increasingly place value on purpose, transparency, and trust. They're generally less tolerant of activities that feel bureaucratic or punitive. And in that environment, audit and assurance can face a legitimacy problem if they are seen mainly as compliance and conformance exercises rather than contributors to improvement and value. Again, our work on the future of assurance makes the point that assurance needs to support confidence, learning, and informed decision-making, not simply that retrospective confirmation of what has happened. At the same time, external expectations are changing also. Supply chain fragility, sustainability concerns, wider stakeholder scrutiny all place pressure on organisations to show not merely that control exists, but that they work in practice. So audit is under scrutiny from two directions: internally, from staff questioning its relevance and usefulness, and externally, from stakeholders asking whether the assurance being provided is credible. And that means audit value is no longer something that can be taken for granted, it has to be demonstrated. This shift helps explain why contemporary audit guidance needs to put more emphasis on insight, adaptability, and relevance, and on linking assurance more clearly to organisational purpose and stakeholder expectations. Next slide, please. So this really is the point we move from why things are changing to what that looks like in practice. Up to this point, the argument has been that context for audit and assurance has shifted quite materially through greater complexity, technological change, systematic risk, and changing expectations of value. What's important to stress here is that 19,011-2026 is not trying to respond to that by reinventing audit from first principles. It's not a revolution, it's an evolution. It doesn't attempt to replace the core principles of audit. It doesn't introduce an entirely new model of assurance. Instead, it's better understood as part of an incremental shift, a gradual rebalance that reflects both how audit practice is already changing and where it needs to adapt further. And this aligns very closely with CQI's wider thinking. And with that context in place, we can turn to the revised guidance itself, and look at the clause-by-clause changes, not as isolated technical edits, but as practical expressions of that wider shift in audit and assurance, on which I have great pleasure in handing over to my colleague Linda.
Good morning, everybody, and it's really good to be here. I've been involved as an auditor, an internal auditor, as a trainer, training for internal, external audits, training for various management system standards as well, and also as a UCAS assessor as well when I go in and check that certification bodies are doing the right thing, and also observe a lot of audits. To make sure that the auditor is competent and that the audits are objective and reaching a fair conclusion for what has been seen, for the evidence seen. So I've got a lot of experience of seeing what's happening. So I'm going to take you through 19011, not every single change that's been made, but really the key changes that have been made there. Next slide, please. So the updated guidance, primarily around remote auditing methods. We all know now that a lot more is done remotely, and there are virtual locations, places where really there isn't an office, there isn't a physical premises that we go to for some areas. Risk-based approach, and Alex very much there talking about the risks of what is happening in today's world and how that impacts on audits and supply chain as well. Now, one thing that is important now in 19011 is that it does reference the standard 17012, which was published in 2024. So this is from the Conformity Assessment Series, the 17,000 series, guidelines for the use of remote auditing methods in auditing management systems. That goes into far, far more details purely about the remote auditing methods. Some of that is in 19011, but of course we haven't repeated all of that. So if you want to have far more information, do get hold of 17012. Next slide, please. So first of all, there are some terminology changes across the whole standard. The term auditing organisation is used when referring to the organisation carrying out the audit. Now, that might be an internal auditor, so within the same organisation. It could be an internal auditor that you have brought in from a consultancy company, for example. It could be a supplier coming in to audit, or you going out to audit one of your suppliers. So various organisations that it could be, but they're all known as auditing organisation, which might be the same as your own organisation. Audit client is used for the ones that request the audit, and that's distinguished from the auditee, which is the organisation being audited. Now, if it is a true internal audit with an internal auditor from within the organisation, they are going to be one and the same organisation, but very often they're slightly different. So audit client auditing. Organisations in the supply chain used to be referred to as external providers. But that supply chain in a very large organisation might actually have some suppliers from another part of that organisation. And also they may be external, and again they may go down into subcontractors, etc. So that supply chain can be quite complex and quite long. So we now refer to organisations in the supply chain, and that comes into a few of the recommendations of the guidance. Instead of referring to the extent of the audit programme, we refer to the scope of the audit programme. What's the scope? What areas of the business, what standards, what criteria, etc. are we going to put into the audit programme? That is the scope now, not the extent. There's a few other minor updates in terminology just to improve readability, but these are the critical ones. Next slide, please. So terms and definitions, there's one new term, remote auditing method. The method used for conducting audit activities from any place other than the location of the auditee. Now, there are several notes. I'm not going to go through all of those. The notes confirm that remote methods can be used in combination with on-site methods. And that's quite common. I see that a lot, where you might have a remote auditor with obviously the on-site auditees. You might have one remote auditor, one on-site auditor, all different combinations that we have there to ensure that in today's world this all works well. Now, virtual locations we talked about as one of the areas that is expanded on in 1911. It isn't actually defined as a separate term, but in Note 2 for remote auditing method, it expands on virtual locations. And what it says there, it is where an organisation performs work or provides a service using an online environment, enabling individuals to execute processes irrespective of physical locations. So it's talking about your virtual systems, your virtual processes that you've got there, which may not be purely in a physical location. So that's when it talks about virtual locations. One other change to point out, and there are a few other minor changes besides these, the definition of audit conclusion. It used to say result of an audit. It now says outcome. Sorry, it used to say outcome of an audit. It now says result of an audit. And this mirrors changes in all of the management system standards. So any of the more recent management system standards have removed the use of the term outcome and replaced it by result. That is because there was some translation issues and understanding issues in some countries of the term outcome, and therefore the term result has been used instead. Next slide. So principles. We've got some additional explanation in principles. So the principles remain the same. The principles of the auditing remain the same. The independence principle. So this used to refer to say, and it has now lost the text, for internal audits, auditors should be independent of the function being audited if practicable. That has gone. Instead now it says in situations where independence is not possible, every effort should be made to remove bias and encourage objectivity. So it recognises that in a particularly small organisations, but maybe also in some larger organisations too, it's not possible to have somebody completely independent. But we could have somebody who is maybe a little bit removed and can think without bias and encourage objectivity. Now, the reference to this only being applicable to smaller organisations has now been removed because this can equally apply in a large organisation. Now, for the risk-based principle, that previously only talked about the risk in planning, conducting and reporting audits. But it now recognises, as Alex was saying, that we've got to be much more serious on looking at risk and taking this risk-based approach. And so that also applies to planning and implementation of the audit programme. We've got to consider what are the risks of that audit programme and how that then influences how we plan that and how we implement that. Finally, the confidentiality programme used to talk purely about confidentiality of information. It now says confidentiality and privacy of information. Next slide, please. So, managing an audit programme. There's some new and some clarified inputs to the design of the audit programme and of its objectives as well. So we've got to have in the scope of the management system standards. Climate change, of course, that's relatively new in there. Climate change as an issue has to be considered when we are preparing and managing the audit programme. The organisation's context, their risks and their opportunities. So putting that up front. So that means we've got to go out and try and find some information early on while we're designing and managing this audit programme. Complexity, and Alex talked about complexity and how that is increasing these days now. So we've really got to take that into account on aspects such as size, number of locations, extent of outsourced functions, and many other aspects as well of complexity. Thinking about participation of observations and others in the audit, what is the criteria for them? So I, as a UCAS assessor, will go in and observe audits. We've got to have permission to do that. You know, why am I there? We've got to make it very clear, why am I there doing that to the auditee organisation. Auditees' application of technology and digital tools, and that, so how much is the auditee using technology, digital tools, AI, etc. these days? How does that all come together that may well impact how we're organising and managing this audit programme? The audit methods, of course, the capability of ICT, is it going to be remote? Is the auditor going to be remote? Are some of the auditees remote? Some of them on site? How is that all going to work? And of course, the risks of all of that. You know, what if it all goes down? What if it doesn't work? And clarification that audit follow-up is not always needed. That was previously implied that you always needed to follow up an audit, but actually if an audit has not come out with any findings, it's all gone well, don't need to do anything for another year or so, but actually there's no follow-up on that. So that's been clarified now. Next slide, please. Audit programme content, so a little bit more about the content here. So we've talked already about the criteria for the participation of observers and some information relating to the organisation's context was in there on the management. Audit objectives. Now, if you've got a large audit programme covering multiple management system standards, the objectives may be different for each one. They might be at different stages of initial audit, surveillance audit, recertification audit. But actually, just because they're different topics, they may well have different objectives, and the organisation itself may be looking at different ways, different objectives for each of these MSS. So really important difference there. Also, we may have some sector-specific management system standards. So consider those, particularly around the objectives and the real differences of all auditing the base standard and the sector-specific version of a standard as well, where that applies. And for audit reports now, they have to be distributed to previously determined parties. So we need to think way back at the audit programme, audit planning there, who's the audit report going to go to here? Who's going to be relevant in this case? Next slide, please. Risks. So we've talked about there's going to be risks for audit programs now. So some examples are given here. Lack of auditor independence, selection of unsuitable auditing methods, selection of methods based on unsecured or ineffective IT tools. So risk there for your information. Failure to conduct the audits or unavailability of audits or evidence. Lack of top management sponsorship, undue influence over delivery. And I'm sure if we open this up to all of you on the call, we'd come up with some more as well. Those are just some examples which are put in there. But we do need now to think about risk for audit programs as well as risk for individual audits. Next slide, please. Conducting the audit. So the feasibility of the audit is determined taking into account local, regional and world events. Can we imagine when we had COVID, regional and world events coming in there? So a lot has happened since the last version of 19.11, so we have to think about all of these things. Additional guidance on risk for joint audits are in there now. That's where an audit is carried out at a single auditee by 2 or more auditing organisations. Obviously, we've got to be coordinated on how that's going to work. Desktop review of documented information needs to include looking at risks that documented information may bring out to whoever's doing that review. And any significant risks identified during the audit need to go to the individual managing the audit programme, as well as the audit client and the auditee. Next slide, please. Audit conclusions. There's some new text here advising that when non-conformities are graded, we've got to be clear on the criteria. So this might be if you have minor or major non-conformities. What are the criteria for those? Or you may have some other named grades of non-conformity as well. So we've got to be very clear and make sure those are defined and communicated. Now, if a non-conformity has not been presented and discussed during the audit or the closing meeting, you can't put that in the audit report later. I know what it's like to when you finish your closing meeting the next day, you're writing up your audit report, you're going through all your notes, and you find, oh, I missed that one. You can't then go back and put it in. So you could do something like there is a concern that whatever it is, you can suggest that this area is followed up in the next audit to move something forward there. Reminder to also report and feedback on positive things. What went well? What was conformant? Obviously, you're not going to go through everything, but bring out any of the really good practice that's seen there. And reminder that when making recommendations, you're not a consultant. You've got to remain objective and impartial, not consulting on how you think something should be done in there. Next slide, please. Competence of auditors, some more items there in there. Auditing methods, particularly looking at competence around auditing where everything is based on technology, on AI, on all the different ways of actually auditing as well. So auditors really do need to be up to date on that. And also a reminder about applicable statutory and regulatory requirements, including an understanding of data protection and information security, but very much with a note. And I constantly have to remind people on this one. if somebody asks you to look at statutory and regulatory requirements, it does not expect you to be an absolute legal expert. That's not your job as an auditor. It does not imply legal expertise, and a management system audit cannot be treated as a legal compliance audit. That needs to be something different. Next slide, please. Audit personal behaviours. What there used to be one called tenacious. The title of that has been changed to determined, but the definition remains the same: persistent and focused on achieving objectives. The behaviour called fortitude has been deleted. We really felt that that was covered by other personal behaviours, and that one wasn't needed anymore. And a little bit about evaluation of auditor performance that should be managed, be done by the individual managing the audit programme. Next slide, please. So Annex A is guidance on some of the subclauses there. And the first part is the Table A1 auditing methods. So there's a couple of things there that I've shown in red that have been updated. So if you're on site with human interaction, then observing work performed is a very valid and typical method of auditing as well. If you are remote with human interaction, sampling is still relevant there. You're still sampling in what you're doing, so that's been added in. I'm sure everybody was doing that before, but it wasn't specifically written into Table A1. Next slide, please. So annexes A2 to A12, so there's various changes in the annex. So in auditing the processes A2, the process approach has been substantively reworked, the wording, but really the message is the same. A5, verifying information, some new text relating to disposal of information and audit evidence, making sure that that's still kept in a secure way. A7, auditing compliance, clarifying that if you use the word compliance, it's relevant to statutory and regulatory requirements. Other audit criteria will use the term conformance or conformity. A9, auditing leadership and commitment. So auditors should interview top management to confirm that they acknowledge their accountability. Don't shy away from interviewing top management. Really, really important to ensure that they're really buying into this and they really do accept their accountability there and understand it. A12, audit of supply chain, so substantively reworked now, as I discussed earlier. Next slide, please. So A15 and A16, these are the areas with the most significant changes in the guidance, as you would expect. So text has been moved between them, changed some titles in there. So remote auditing methods, it's the joint responsibility of the auditee and auditee to ensure that that works properly, that it is effectively conducted and the audit objectives are achieved. So be clear, who's going to provide the technology, make sure you've got the right access rights, what are the contingency plans, what about confidentiality, data security, etc., all of those things. And remote auditing can be used for auditing physical and virtual locations. Next slide, please. And the final one, audit findings, has some new text reminding auditors that non-conformities should include the reason why the audit criteria were not met. And there's also a reminder about the grade of the non-conformity if grading has been agreed with the client. Next slide, please. And we are moving on to the Q&A.
Fantastic. That's really amazing, Linda and Alex. That's very, very in-depth in what I think is a very short amount of time. We have quite a number of questions submitted. We have some pre-submitted questions as well. Thank you to the audience for sending those in. I'd like to initially put this one to Alex, if that's okay. So what can you recommend for an effective way to execute the audits?
To an extent, I think Linda has pointed us towards the answer in her summary. Audit has to be explicitly and deliberately risk-based. That means just abandon the audit schedule. If you've got one, put it in the bin. Follow the risk and chase it. But also make sure that audit process, that audit is following the process and the lived reality of the organisation, not just the clauses of whichever standard is being audited against. And if that evidence takes you to a deeper issue, you need to continue to follow it. You don't move on because the audit schedule says that you have to. So this means more. This means deeper drilling. It means less mechanical coverage. And this really is the difference between auditing for conformance and auditing for value. I think the other point really is that assurance, in a broader sense, shouldn't be just the job of the auditor. The people involved in the work need to be actively engaged, not just through interviewing them when it's their turn on the audit schedule, which you've put in the bin, so it doesn't really matter. But you're actively engaging them in interrogating the processes, identifying what's going wrong, what's going right, where there are opportunities to improve, and importantly, where the risks are from their perspective. So in doing that, they need to understand the broader context of the standard or the discipline they're working to. They need to understand the value and purpose of the audit. So this positions the auditor much closer to a kind of business partnering model, which is something that we've been exploring from the perspectives of, from the perspective of the quality professional, and how that role is evolving in many contexts into a business partnering approach. And this is something we're going to be exploring at Quality Live next week. And that I think is the model that audit needs to follow.
Okay, that's fantastic. If we can
I add in a little bit on there, Gavin?
Yeah.
So I agree with everything that Alex has been saying there, and how I like to go in and have been doing way before an update to 19011, is always start with the context of the organisation. What's the organisation doing? If it's a subsequent audit, what's changed? What's changed in their business? What's changed in their management system? What's changed in their people? Have their objectives changed? Their objectives for the management system. And I think objectives for management systems are not for the audit, but the clients, the organisation's objectives for why they've got that management system, the quality objectives, service management objectives, information security objectives, whatever they are. You can get a lot from there, and you can also question a lot about that, because sometimes they're just textbook ones rather than what's actually really relevant to the organisation. And it's only from understanding all of that as an auditor up front on the audit that you can then start to go into the detailed questions. If you go straight into detailed questions, you're not doing an audit with the correct context, with the correct understanding of what you've got, and therefore you're not going to be adding the value. The thing that I really love from auditing is if you get to the end of the audit and you get to the closing meeting and the top managers say, we're really pleased with that, we're really glad that you pointed that out because it helps us to improve, you've really added some value to us. And then you know that's gone really well.
There are a couple of words there that I'd really like to pull out, if I may. The killer questions are, why are you doing this? And you don't need to go down the route of 5 whys and just asking why until you've got a headache. But it's a fundamentally important question, like, why are you doing this? Why do you have a systematic approach to managing quality, information security, whatever it may be? So why, and what has changed? If I'm coming to you now What has changed from the last time that I came to speak to you? And those questions, if you're asking them across the organisation at different points within the process, getting the perspective from all the people who are involved in that system, the kind of insight that you will get is so much deeper and more valuable.
That's amazing. Thank you very much. Shall we move on to the next question, Linda and Alex?
Sure.
Thank you. So this is to you initially, Linda, one of the pre-submitted questions. So how do you introduce the standard across the organisation?
The new version of the standard, I'm assuming that question means. So this is not a requirement standard. So it doesn't have a transition period, if you like, like 9001's coming out later this year. That'll probably have 3 years before everybody's got to meet the requirements of that one for certification, etc., etc. This is a guidance standard, so it doesn't have that sort of thing. But what we would advise is the world has changed. The world of your own organisation, the world of auditing has changed, as Alex was covering earlier today. And this standard has been updated as a result of that. So we really would recommend that people do buy this standard, maybe get the training on this standard, to really help to improve that auditing process. So introducing it across the organisation. Do you have your own internal auditors? Do they all need to be trained up? Do they all need to understand that? You need to have discussions around that. The person responsible for the audit programme need to be revisiting that audit programme, revisiting with the new requirements, also revisiting with looking at any risks there, with looking at the technologies we're going to use. What about the training where for auditing across technologies, where we said competence for the auditors needed to be around the technology for doing the audit and the technology that you're going to be seeing and looking at as evidence these days on what they're doing, and also really delving into how they're using their technologies, what they're doing, is it valid? Is it ethical? Or all of those sort of things in there. So a lot to consider about introducing the organisation as introducing any other new standard or something that's new coming in. Yes, it's a revision, but it's quite a big revision. So do plan it, do a proper plan for bringing that in, and make sure you're covering all the relevant people.
Linda is much nicer than I am. My take on this, which I think is a very important issue, is that if as an organisation or if as an individual you are already using ISO 19011 as a way of providing guidance for your audit practice, and you are not familiar with the details of the changes to the standard and what 19,011-2026 contains, then you are incompetent. Now that may sound really blunt, but competence is a binary thing. It's having the knowledge, skills, and experience, values and behaviours in order to successfully complete an objective. And you either have the necessary knowledge, skills, behaviours, etc., or you do not. If one of the foundational documents, one of the foundational pieces of guidance that you're using has changed, then in order to be competent, you must be familiar with the changes. Now, as Linda quite rightly pointed out, it's a guidance standard. Organisations, auditors don't have to use it. There's no certification against it. But if you are making the decision that this is part of your competence matrix, if you like, then you need to know what's changed. So I would go very much with a stick approach to this, which may not be popular, but having a good understanding of what your professional competence looks like, understanding again what has changed and why, the questions we looked at earlier, what that means for you personally, and then taking a systematic approach to planning your professional development, undertaking activities that are going to address the objectives within that plan, reflecting on what you've learned, and then being able to demonstrate that in practice. It's a PDCA approach to professional development.
and do check act if I've got that right. Thank you so much. That's really great. We've just going to go to one more question, and just to note that we've had a lot of questions in the a lot of live questions that we can't obviously all go to. We've only got a few minutes left today. We'll endeavour to provide an FAQ, frequently asked questions answer sheet after the webinar to all the attendees. So my last question really is initially to Linda. So how long do we have to, how long do users, I should say, have to implement changes?
As I was saying earlier, it's not a requirement standard. So it's up to each organisation how long they have in their plans to implement these changes. I would advise as quickly as possible, get it done, do a reasonable amount of time in order to allow, buy the standard, read the standard, get the training done, you know, get the competence updated to the competence requirements, redo your audit program. You know, you're not going to be able to do that in a month. You know, it depends on the size of what you're doing here. So it could be 6 months, 3 months, 6 months, a year. See how long you require to do that.
Okay, thank you. And Alex, did you want to add any closing statement on that at all?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's too late. You have to have already done it. But you know, the reality, as Linda explained, it's going to take time to review and understand what these changes mean, what it means for your audit program, what it means for your professional development, etc. And it's also worth bearing in mind that, you know, as a guidance document for auditing management system standards, one should necessarily look at 19,011 through the lens, or at least next to, whichever management system standards you as an organisation are using, and where they're relevant. So, you know, we've talked about the update to 9001 coming on. I know you can buy a copy of the draft FDIS. It's still out for ballot, but it's there, and I think that's going to be published around October. But when you're looking at that document, then you should be looking at 19,011 alongside it, so you understand not just the changes that need to be implemented to your system, but also how you're going to go about planning and executing and reporting the audit. And that applies to any management system standard that you may be using.
Thank you very much. That's absolutely fantastic. So to close off, thank you to our experts, Linda and Alex, who presented today and helped develop the revision. Thank you to everyone who joined today's session and for asking such great questions, and also a special thank you to the BSI events team for such an excellent webinar organisation and support. We'll be putting together a summary of all the questions and answers from today and sharing it with attendees shortly after the webinar, so have it on hand for reference. And just as a brief reminder, whether you manage audits, lead audit teams, or are building your own competence as an auditor, this revised standard offers a timely opportunity to strengthen how you plan, conduct and report audits in an increasingly remote and hybrid landscape. Thank you very much, and I believe we will close today on some slides for how to get involved in standards development. Please do get in touch. And finally, we have a slide on the Young Professionals Network, which is also a very, very successful project underway at BSI for a while. Thank you very much indeed.